Imagine a photograph. It's black and white, grainy. A woman is sleeping, but she's not in a bed, she's on the cold, curved floor of a tunnel. Her head rests on a small bag. Around her, dozens of other bodies are curled up in the dim light. This wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary, it was the London Underground. When the bombs began to fall on London in September 1940, the city was not ready. The government had a plan, but the people had a different one. They saw the tube stations deep beneath the ground and decided for themselves. This was where they would survive. Night after night, up to 177,000 people disappeared from the streets. They went down into the earth to live a second life, a strange, cramped, and sometimes terrifying existence. It was a war under the war. What did it mean to live, sleep, and even love in a train station while the world above was on fire? Was this the great moment of British unity we hear about, or was it something darker, a story of desperation, dirt, and disease? The photos show us smiles and cups of tea, but what do they hide? Number 10. Was it ever meant to be this way? No. The answer is a simple no. The government was terrified of the idea. Before the war in 1939, a committee was led by a man named Lord Haley. They produced the Haley Report. The report looked at using the underground's tunnels and stations as public air raid shelters. Its conclusion was blunt. It was a bad idea, a very bad idea. The officials had several fears. They worried about health. They were cramming thousands of people into unventilated tunnels, seemed like a perfect recipe for epidemics. They worried about safety. A direct hit on a station entrance could trap and kill everyone inside. The tunnels were vital for transport, moving workers and troops around the city. Closing them down for shelters would cripple London's ability to function. But there was another fear, a deeper one. They called it deep shelter mentality. The government, particularly the Home Secretary Sir John Anderson, believed that if people were given perfectly safe, deep shelters, they would refuse to come out. They would lose the will to work, to fight, to endure. They would become a nation of troglodytes, hiding from the enemy and waiting for the war to end. This idea was rooted in studies of bombing from other conflicts, which suggested civilian morale was fragile. I thought Londoners would crack under the pressure. So the official policy was set. The tube was for trains, not for people seeking shelter. Anderson promoted the small backyard Anderson shelter instead. The government printed posters telling people the stations were not safe. The people of London didn't listen. On the first night of the Blitz, September 7th, 1940, the bombing was intense. East London was burning. People grabbed their blankets and pillows and just walked into the tube stations. They bought a cheap ticket and refused to leave. At some stations, the staff tried to stop them. But how can a handful of ticket collectors stop a crowd of desperate families? The people took over. It was a quiet, determined invasion. They flowed down the escalators and onto the platforms. They weren't asking for permission. They were claiming the space. The government was caught completely off guard. The next day, the pressure was immense. Newspapers reported on the spontaneous occupation of the underground. One of the key figures who had to deal with this was Herbert Morrison, who soon replaced Anderson as Home Secretary. Morrison was a pragmatist. He saw that the government couldn't fight its own people while also fighting a war. The public had made its choice. Within a week, the official policy was in ruins. The government had to accept reality. The tube stations were now official public shelters, but this reluctant acceptance created a new set of problems. The stations had no beds, no toilets, no food, and no medical facilities. The government had been forced into a situation it never wanted, and now it had to figure out how to manage a city living under the city. The people had won the first battle, not against the bombers, but against their own leaders. What we still do not know is startling. How many people were injured in the initial chaotic scrambles for space before any organization was in place? Did the government secretly draft plans to forcibly clear the stations if the deep shelter mentality they feared actually took hold? What were the private conversations between Herbert Morrison and Winston Churchill as they realized their pre-war plans had been completely overturned by a spontaneous public revolt? Number 9. What did it sound, smell, and feel like? Imagine the air. It's the first thing people talked about. It was thick, warm, and stale. The London Underground was never designed for thousands of people to sleep in it for hours on end. The ventilation systems were basic, meant to clear train fumes and the breath of moving passengers. They were not built to handle the oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide output of a stationary population of 177,000 souls. The air quickly became foul. It was a cocktail of odors. There was the smell of unwashed bodies, of damp wool coats, of stale food. There was the sharp, chemical smell of disinfectant, which was constantly sprayed in a losing battle against germs and lice. And underneath it all, there was the smell of fear, the metallic tang of sweat. A research group called Mass Observation documented this period in incredible detail. They sent observers into the shelters to write down exactly what they saw, heard, and smelled. Their diaries are a raw, unfiltered look at this underground life. One observer in November 1940 wrote about the thick, sweet, fecal smell near the overflowing chemical toilets. Another described the air as a solid substance you had to push through. The lack of oxygen made people feel drowsy and lethargic. Headaches were common. For people with asthma or other respiratory problems, a night in the shelter could be a genuine medical ordeal. Then there were the sounds. The tube was still a working railway. Trains would rumble through the stations late into the evening and start again early in the morning. The platforms were the prime spots for sleeping, so people would be lying just feet away from the screeching wheels and rattling carriages. But the sound of the trains was often a comfort. It was a normal sound, a reminder of the world that still existed. The other sounds were not so normal. Above, the city was under attack. You couldn't always hear the planes, but you could feel them. The ground would transmit the vibrations of the anti-aircraft guns, a deep rhythmic thudding that shook your bones. And then there was the sound of the bombs. A distant crump was good news. It meant it had hit somewhere else. But sometimes there was a high-pitched whistle, followed by a violent concussion that would make the tunnel shudder. The lights would flicker. Dust would fall from the ceiling. In those moments, the sound was silence. The entire platform would hold its breath, waiting to see if they were safe. The feeling was one of profound claustrophobia. The platforms were packed solid. People were allocated a tiny amount of space, often just enough to lie down. You were pressed against strangers on all sides. There was no privacy. Every cough, every snore, every whispered conversation was public. The lighting was poor, just a few dim bulbs casting long, eerie shadows down the curved tunnels. It was a world of perpetual twilight. Bill Brandt, a photographer, captured this atmosphere in a series of famous images for the Ministry of Information. His photos show rows of bodies cocooned in blankets, their faces pale and anonymous in the gloom. They look less like people sleeping and more like ancient burials. The feeling was of being buried alive, a temporary death to escape a permanent one. But what do we really not know about the sensory experience? How many cases of long-term lung damage, like emphysema, can be traced back to breathing that toxic air night after night? Did the constant low-level vibration from the bombing and the trains have a measurable neurological impact, especially on the developing brains of children? And without modern recording equipment, what were the exact decibel levels during a heavy raid, and what did that do to people's hearing over the months and years of the Blitz? Number 8, how did you sleep on a concrete curve? In the first few weeks, it was chaos. People slept where they could. They lay down on the cold, hard concrete of the platforms. The platforms were sloped towards the tracks for drainage, which made for an uncomfortable night's sleep. People would roll towards the edge. Some brought cardboard or newspapers to lie on, a pathetic barrier against the damp and the cold. Families would huddle together for warmth. The writer and social commentator George Orwell observed the shelter scene and wrote about the sour, sweet smell of the tube and the sight of people packed like soldiers in a troop train. The conditions were appalling. It was clear that this makeshift arrangement couldn't last. The government, now reluctantly in charge, had to act. The man tasked with bringing order to the chaos was Herbert Morrison. One of his first priorities was to make the shelters more humane. He appointed a committee, the London County Council, to design and procure beds. This led to the creation of the tube shelter bunk. It was a simple, starkly functional design, a frame of steel tubes holding a wire mesh mattress stacked 3 high. They were designed to be cheap to produce and easy to install. The contract for manufacturing many of these bunks was given to a company run by a man named Frederick Minter, and they were sometimes known as Minter bunks. The installation began in late 1940. It was a huge logistical challenge. Bunks had to be brought into the stations at night, after the train stopped running, and bolted to the walls and floors. By early 1941, over 22,000 of these triple-tiered bunks had been installed, providing sleeping space for around 66,000 people. This was a fraction of the total shelter population, but it was a start. Getting a bunk was a matter of luck, or sometimes who you knew. A ticketing system was introduced. You could buy a reservation for a specific bunk for a small fee. This created a new social hierarchy in the shelters. Those with bunks were the aristocracy of the platform. Those without had to make do on the floor or the escalators, which were turned off at night and used as giant slanting dormitories. Life on the bunks was not luxurious. The wire mesh was hard and unforgiving. There were no mattresses, only the thin blanket you brought from home. Privacy was non-existent. You were sleeping inches away from a stranger above, below, and next to you. And there were new problems. The top bunk was the warmest, as heat rises, but it was also the most exposed if any debris fell from the ceiling. The bottom bunk was the coldest and dampest. Lice and other pests thrived in the bedding. But despite all this, the bunks were a massive improvement. They got people off the cold concrete. They organized the space, creating narrow aisles where people could walk. They represented a fundamental shift in thinking the government was no longer just tolerating the shelterers, it was actively providing for them. It was an admission that this underground life was not a temporary anomaly, but a long-term reality of the war. Yet, crucial questions remain unanswered. What was the exact profit margin Frederick Minter's company made on the bunk contract, and was there any political favoritism involved in awarding it? How many people sustained injuries from falling out of the high, narrow bunks, which had no safety rails? And most intriguingly, are there any undiscovered caches of these original bunks, forgotten in some disused part of the underground network, silent relics of the war under the streets? Number 7, who was your neighbor in the dark? The popular memory of the Blitz, often called the Blitz Spirit, is one of perfect social harmony. It's a story where class divisions melted away in the face of a common enemy. The Duchess and the Dustman huddled together on the platform, sharing a flask of tea. There is some truth to this. The shared danger did create a powerful sense of community. Strangers looked after each other's children. People shared their meager rations. Impromptu sing-alongs, often led by a local with an accordion or a ukulele, would fill the tunnels. Songs like Raw at the Barrel became anthems of defiance against the bombs falling above. This community spirit was actively managed. In many stations, the shelterers elected their own leaders. A shelter marshal, usually a respected local figure, would be responsible for keeping order, settling disputes, and liaising with the authorities. Committees were formed to organize entertainment, run first aid posts, and manage the shelter library, often just a box of donated books. The writer and later politician Tom Dryburgh described the vibrant social life he saw at Canning Town Station, and he wrote about the extraordinary cheerfulness and friendliness of the people. This was the image the government wanted to promote. It was a powerful piece of propaganda showing a nation united and unbreakable, but the reality was far more complex. The darkness and anonymity of the shelters also provided cover for less noble human behaviors. Mass observation diaries are filled with complaints about selfishness and crime. People stole blankets, food, and reservation tickets for the coveted bunks. Fights would break out over a few inches of sleeping space. Gangs of youths would sometimes terrorize a platform, extorting cigarettes or food from more vulnerable shelterers. These class divisions did not simply disappear. Wealthier people from neighborhoods like Kensington or Hampstead often tried to create their own exclusive sections of the platform, using their luggage to build barriers. There were reports of people trying to bribe shelter marshals for the best sleeping spots, near the entrance for better air, or away from the noisy toilets. There was also a hidden social life that the official histories rarely mention. The enforced intimacy of the shelters led to new relationships. Young couples with nowhere else to go would find a measure of privacy in the shadows of the tunnels. There was a documented rise in what was euphemistically called shelter morale problems. The close quarters and the sense of living on borrowed time led to a loosening of pre-war social conventions. But it wasn't all romance. The darkness also gave cover to predators. There were documented cases of sexual assault, though the numbers are likely a vast underreporting of the problem. For a woman or child, a trip to the unlit toilets at the end of the platform could be a terrifying experience. The shelter was both a community and a jungle, a place of immense kindness and quiet menace, and this leaves us with some unsettling questions. How many criminal convictions were ever secured for crimes committed deep underground away from the eyes of the regular police? What was the true scale of sexual harassment and assault, a figure that the wartime authorities would have had every reason to suppress? And did the social networks formed on the platforms persist after the war, creating new, unseen community bonds that reshaped London's neighborhoods in the 1950s? Number 6, could you get a cup of tea down there? For the first few weeks, you were on your own. People brought what they could carry: a flask of tea, a few sandwiches, a bottle of milk for the baby. But as the Blitz dragged on, it was clear that this was not sustainable. People were spending 8, 10, even 12 hours underground. They needed food and drink. The logistics of feeding a subterranean city were staggering. The London Passenger Transport Board (LPTB), which ran the underground, rose to the challenge. They started running special refreshment trains. These were carriages stocked with tea urns, milk, sugar, and simple food like sandwiches and meat pies. The trains would pull into the stations during the lulls in the bombing. Volunteers, often from the Women's Voluntary Service WVS, would serve the food directly onto the platforms. Imagine the scene, the rumble of the train arriving, the hiss of steam from the tea urns, the sight of women in green uniforms pouring thousands of cups of hot, sweet tea. For many, this cup of tea was more than just a warm drink. It was a symbol of order and care in the midst of chaos. It was a sign that someone somewhere was still in control. The cost was minimal, just a penny or two a cup, but its value to morale was immeasurable. By the end of 1940, these services were providing hundreds of thousands of snacks and drinks every night. Beyond the official canteens, a whole informal economy developed. People with an entrepreneurial spirit would bring extra supplies and sell them. A woman who managed to get a Primus stove working might sell hot water for a halfpenny. Someone else might sell single cigarettes for an inflated price. This informal trade filled the gaps that the official services couldn't. It also inevitably led to a black market. Ration goods like sugar, butter, and tinned meat would appear for sale at exorbitant prices, a source of tension between those who could afford them and those who couldn't. Organizing this all fell to the shelter marshals and the air raid precautions ARP wardens. The ARP wardens were the civilian face of authority in the shelters. They were volunteers, local men and women who were trained in first aid and firefighting. Down in the tube, their job was less about fighting fires and more about managing people. They enforced the rules, broke up fights, and guided people to the chemical toilets. They were the ones who had to deal with medical emergencies, from a child having a nightmare to an elderly person having a heart attack. They were often the first point of contact when the bombs hit close. They would be the ones to go up to the surface to check for damage, their white helmets a beacon of calm in the darkness. Their presence, along with the regular arrival of the T train, helped transform the stations from chaotic refugee camps into organized, functioning communities. But the full picture is still missing. What was the true extent of the black market operating in the tunnels, and were LPTB employees or ARP wardens ever involved in it? How many serious medical emergencies like heart attacks or strokes occurred on the platforms, and what was the actual survival rate given the primitive first aid facilities? And what happened to the vast quantities of waste generated by this underground population each night, a logistical problem of sanitation that has never been fully documented? Number 5, when the shelter became a tomb. The great unspoken fear of every person who descended into the underground was that the shelter would fail. The tunnels were deep, protected by layers of London clay, but they were not invulnerable. The government's initial warnings about the danger were not entirely propaganda. A large bomb, scoring a direct hit on a station, could have catastrophic consequences. And on the night of October 14th, 1940, that fear became a reality at Balham Station in South London. It was a wet, miserable night. The raid was heavy. Inside Balham Station, hundreds of people were sheltering on the platform of the Northern Line. Shortly after 8 p.m., a large fragmentation bomb of about 1,400 kilograms struck the road directly above the northern end of the station. The bomb itself didn't penetrate the tunnel. The initial blast killed people on the street and sent a bus careering into the crater. But the explosion also fractured a huge water main and a sewage pipe directly above the station tunnel. The crater instantly filled with water, sand, and raw sewage, and then it all came crashing down into the station below. A torrent of water and sludge cascaded down the escalators and stairways, sweeping people off their feet. The lights went out, plunging the station into darkness and chaos. The water level on the platform rose with terrifying speed, trapping people at the far end of the tunnel. It was a scene of absolute horror. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but they were hampered by the darkness, the flooding, and the ongoing air raid. Rescuers had to wade through chest-deep, foul-smelling water to reach the survivors. The official death toll, released at the time, was 68. For years, local legend held that the true number was much higher, and that the government had covered it up to protect morale. However, later research by historians like Nick Cooper, who has extensively studied the tube shelters, has largely confirmed the official figures. The story of the bus falling into the crater and its passengers being swept into the tube is also a myth, though a powerful and enduring one. The Balham disaster sent a shockwave through London. It was a brutal reminder that no shelter was perfectly safe. It exposed the vulnerability of the stations to this kind of indirect damage, a threat no one had seriously considered. The government responded by installing massive floodgates, like the ones you see on a battleship, in the tunnel entrances of many riverside stations. These huge steel doors could be sealed to prevent a similar deluge, but the psychological damage was done. Every time a shelterer heard a nearby explosion, the thought of Balham was in the back of their mind. It added a new layer of anxiety to the nightly ritual of seeking shelter. They were safe from the fire, but they might not be safe from the water. The earth could protect them, but it could also become their grave. Despite the research, some dark questions persist. Why did the myth of a much higher death toll at Balham endure for so long? And was there any element of truth to the initial cover-up, perhaps concerning the speed of the rescue? How many people who survived the initial flood later died from diseases like typhoid or leptospirosis contracted from exposure to the raw sewage? And were there any other near misses at other stations, incidents of partial flooding or structural damage that were successfully contained and never reported to the public? Number 4, did anyone see the beauty in the misery? It is hard to imagine finding beauty in a scene of such squalor and desperation, but some did. Or rather, they found a powerful, haunting humanity that they felt compelled to document. The war under the streets was not just a historical event, it was also a profound cultural moment. 2 artists in particular created the enduring images that have come to define our memory of the tube shelters, the photographer Bill Brandt and the sculptor and artist Henry Moore. Bill Brandt was a German-born photographer who had become a British citizen. During the Blitz, he was commissioned by the Ministry of Information to photograph life in London. He was drawn to the shelters. Using a wide-angle lens and often long exposures, he created a series of photos that are both documentary and deeply artistic. His most famous image, Liverpool Street Extension Shelter, shows a seemingly endless tunnel receding into the darkness, lined with sleeping figures wrapped in blankets. They look like chrysalises, their forms indistinct, their faces hidden. There is no Blitz Spirit in this photo. There is only a sense of deep, collective hibernation, a retreat from a world too terrible to face. Brandt's photographs were not straightforward propaganda. They were dark, melancholic, and claustrophobic. They captured the psychological reality of shelter life, the feeling of being entombed. Henry Moore, already an established sculptor, was an official war artist. He was stuck in London during the Blitz and began to use the tube shelters as his subject. He couldn't sculpt down there, so he drew. Armed with a sketchbook, a pen, and some wax crayons, he would walk through the stations at night, observing the sleeping masses. His shelter drawings are some of the most iconic artworks of the Second World War. Like Brandt, he was not interested in patriotic cheerfulness. He saw the sleeping figures as monumental, almost geological forms. In his drawings, the people merge with the tunnel walls, their blanket-shrouded bodies echoing the curves of the architecture. He famously said they reminded him of the hold of a slave ship, but also of something eternal, like figures in a stone tomb. His work captured both the degradation and the profound dignity of the shelters. These artists were not alone. The popular magazine Picture Post published photo essays that showed a more human, less stylized version of shelter life. Writers described the scenes in their diaries and novels. The government's own propaganda machine, while preferring images of smiling faces and cups of tea, understood the power of Brandt's and Moore's work. It showed the world that Britain was not just a nation of soldiers, but a nation of culture that could find deep meaning even in its darkest hour. These images shaped how the world saw the Blitz and how the British saw themselves. They transformed a squalid reality into a powerful national myth of endurance. But what don't we know about this artistic record? Were Brandt or Moore ever pressured by ministry officials to censor their more disturbing sketches or photographs? And are there any unseen works that were deemed too bleak for public consumption? How did the shelterers themselves react to being sketched and photographed in their most vulnerable moments? Did they feel honored or simply exploited? And beyond these famous names, how many amateur artists, poets, and writers were documenting their experiences on scraps of paper, creating a vast, uncollected archive of underground art that is now lost forever. Number 3, what happened when the bombs stopped? The main period of the Blitz, the intense nightly bombing of London, lasted for about 8 months, from September 1940 to May 1941. In May 1941, the German Air Force shifted its focus to the east in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The nightly raids on London stopped. The sirens still sounded occasionally, but the constant, terrifying pressure was gone. For Londoners, it was a strange and disorienting peace. The question was, what would they do now? Would they abandon the shelters and return to their own beds? For many, the answer was yes. The number of people sleeping in the tube dropped dramatically. The platforms began to empty out. But a significant number of people kept coming back, night after night. The shelters had become a habit, a psychological safety net. These people were known as the inveterate shelterers. They had become so accustomed to the noise, the crowds, and the feeling of underground safety that they found it difficult to sleep in their own quiet, vulnerable houses. Mass observation noted this phenomenon, with some people admitting they felt naked or exposed in a proper bed. For them, the rumble of a late-night train was more comforting than the silence of a suburban street. But there was another, more practical reason why many continued to use the shelters. Their homes had been destroyed. An estimated 1 in 6 Londoners was made homeless at some point during the war. For these people, the tube shelter wasn't a choice, it was their only home. They would spend their days trying to salvage belongings from their wrecked houses or navigating the bureaucracy of rehousing, and their nights on their designated bunk in the underground. The shelter community, which had been a temporary nocturnal society, became a more permanent 24-hour reality for a displaced minority. This period, from mid-1941 to mid-1944, is often overlooked. The immediate drama was over, but the underground life continued in a lower key. The canteens still operated, the libraries were still used, and the social life went on. Then, in June 1944, a new and terrifying threat arrived, the V-1 flying bomb, or doodlebug. These were small, pilotless jets with a crude but effective guidance system. They were fired from continental Europe and aimed at London. The sound they made was a terrifying, sputtering roar, which would cut out just before they plunged to the ground and exploded. This was followed later by the V-2, a supersonic rocket that gave no warning at all. This new form of attack drove Londoners back underground. The numbers in the tube shelters swelled again, but the nature of the threat was different. The V-weapons could strike at any time of day or night. The clear distinction between a dangerous night and a safe day was gone. The war was no longer just a nocturnal event. The shelter became a place people might dive into at any time. This final phase of the war brought a new kind of psychological strain, a constant nagging fear that death could fall from a clear blue sky without a moment's warning. The long nights of the Blitz were over, but the war under the streets had entered a new and unpredictable chapter. The questions that remain from this period are significant. What was the exact demographic of the inveterate shelterers? Were they predominantly older, more anxious individuals or families who had lost everything? How did the government manage the problem of people living semi-permanently in the stations, and were there any attempts to move them to more suitable long-term accommodation? And finally, did the indiscriminate 24-hour threat of the V-weapons cause a different, more severe form of psychological trauma than the more predictable nightly raids of the Blitz? Number 2 was the worst danger from above or from within. On March 3rd, 1943, the single worst civilian disaster of the Second World War in Britain occurred. It did not involve a bomb. It did not involve a plane. It happened on a wet, dark staircase leading down into the Bethnal Green tube station, which was being prepared as like a deep-level shelter. The event stands as a terrifying testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest danger is not the enemy, but the desperate, panicked crush of our fellow human beings. That evening, the air raid siren sounded. It was a routine alert, and people began making their way to the shelter in an orderly fashion. Bethnal Green was a huge, newly constructed shelter, not a regular station platform, and could hold thousands. Its entrance was a short, steep flight of 19 steps leading down from the street. The steps were unlit due to the blackout and had become slippery in the rain. There was no central handrail. As a crowd of people gathered at the top of the stairs, a new and unfamiliar sound was heard. It was the sound of a new anti-aircraft rocket battery being fired for the first time from a nearby park. The noise was a deafening, unfamiliar shriek. To the people in the crowd, it sounded like a new kind of bomb. Panic erupted. The crowd surged forward, desperate to get to the safety of the shelter below. A woman carrying a baby in a bundle tripped near the bottom of the narrow staircase. An elderly man fell over her. In an instant, the entrance was blocked, but the crowd from behind, unaware of the blockage and driven by the terrifying noise, kept pushing. The pressure was immense and unstoppable. People were piled one on top of another, crushed and suffocated by the weight of the bodies above them. In the space of a few minutes, 173 people, including 62 children, died. They were not killed by enemy action. They were killed by a tragic, preventable accident. The aftermath was horrific. ARP wardens and police who arrived at the scene were confronted with a solid wall of human bodies, packed into the small stairwell. The government's reaction was one of secrecy and suppression, fearing the catastrophic effect on public morale and perhaps worried about being blamed for the poorly designed entrance. They censored the story completely. The official explanation was that the deaths had been caused by a direct hit from a German bomb. The truth of Bethnal Green was not officially acknowledged until after the war was over. The survivors and the families of the victims were told to remain silent. The trauma of the event was buried under a blanket of official secrecy. The Bethnal Green disaster is a dark counterpoint to the myth of the Blitz Spirit. It shows what can happen when community cohesion breaks down and is replaced by primal fear. It was a failure of planning, a failure of crowd control, and a failure of government transparency. A simple handrail down the middle of the staircase might have saved hundreds of lives. The event was investigated in secret by a magistrate named Lawrence Dunn, whose report laid the blame on the panic and the lack of a crush barrier. But his findings were locked away. The disaster serves as a chilling reminder that the deadliest threats in wartime are not always the obvious ones. The real war, sometimes, is the one against our own panic. Even today, the full story feels incomplete. Why was the new rocket battery fired without any public warning, an act of almost criminal negligence that directly triggered the panic? How high up the chain of command did the decision to cover up the true cause of the disaster go? Did it reach Herbert Morrison, or even Churchill himself? And what was the long-term psychological toll on the survivors and the rescue workers, who were forced to remain silent for years about the true horror of what they had witnessed? Number 1, did we build a new world underground? As the war drew to a close, Londoners emerged from their tunnels. They blinked in the sunlight and surveyed a city that was scarred but not broken. The nightly life of the tube shelters faded into memory. The bunks were dismantled and scrapped. The platforms were cleaned. The trains ran on time, but the experience had changed the city and the country forever. The question is, what was the true legacy of this war under the streets? One powerful argument is that the shelter experience helped pave the way for the post-war welfare state. For the first time, people from all walks of life had been forced into intimate, prolonged contact. The middle classes saw firsthand the poverty and poor health of their working-class neighbors. The government, by providing food, shelter, and medical aid in the tunnels, had accepted a new level of responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. The labor politician and sociologist Richard Titmuss argued in his 1950 book, Problems of Social Policy, that the shared experience of the war created a new sense of collective solidarity. The idea that everyone deserved a basic level of care and security which had been born in the shelters became a cornerstone of the 1945 Labor government's platform, leading to the creation of the National Health Service. The shelter spirit, in this view, became the spirit of a new, more equal Britain. There was also a physical legacy. Alongside the use of existing stations, the government had embarked on a secret project to build 8 massive, deep-level shelters, each capable of holding 8,000 people. These were huge, purpose-built tunnel systems, complete with power, ventilation, and medical facilities. The project, led by the engineer Sir William Halcrow, was a monumental undertaking, but they were completed too late. By the time they were ready, the Blitz was over. Only one, Stockwell, was ever used for public sheltering, and only for a short time. After the war, these vast, empty tunnels were used for everything from storing documents to serving as a cheap hotel for visitors to the 1951 Festival of Britain. They are a silent subterranean monument to a threat that had already passed. But there is a more cynical view of the legacy. The Blitz Spirit may have been more myth than reality, a useful story for a nation trying to rebuild itself. The class divisions, the crime, and the selfishness seen in the shelters did not simply vanish in 1945. And the trauma of the experience left deep, invisible scars on a generation. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the loss of homes and loved ones, all contributed to a level of psychological distress that was rarely discussed. The idea of the stiff upper lip meant that many people simply buried their trauma, which would manifest in other ways for decades to come. Today, there are few visible signs of that underground war. A small plaque at Bethnal Green Station, a memorial at Balham. But the memory persists, shaped by the grainy photos of Bill Brandt and the haunting drawings of Henry Moore. It's a story of incredible resilience of community and of the strange secret life that Londoners built for themselves in the dark. They were not just hiding from a war, they were creating a new kind of society, a temporary city with its own rules, its own culture, and its own dangers. It was a world born of necessity, a testament to the simple, stubborn human desire to survive the night. And so, we are left with the most profound questions of all. Was the sense of national unity forged in the shelters a genuine social revolution, or was it a temporary illusion that papered over the deep cracks in British society? To what extent did the government's successful management of the shelter crisis, after its initial failure, create a public trust in state intervention that made the post-war political consensus possible? And finally, if faced with a similar threat today, would our modern, more individualistic society be capable of creating the same level of community and shared sacrifice that was born in the darkness under the streets of London?